Today what I'm going to talk about is really about strategy and about how strategy has changed as technology delivery has changed over time and how this has actually affected strategy direction both for the technology and for procurement of that technology. The issues that we've seen brought up over with a number of clients that we've been working with, and the insights that we've gained over time with those issues that we've seen. So when we go back into the midst of time and we start looking about technology and how this has actually changed, where originally we go back far enough, we had big, massive mainframe systems that used to take up like a whole basement, and people accessed those systems over a very thin terminal. As systems got better and we were able to do more with our end terminals and they became PCs, we had more distributed systems because it was difficult to get all that information between all those systems. So they were more distributed throughout the whole organisation, when we tended to have centralised databases for reporting. And then as, again, networks have got cheaper and we've got better and better bandwidth out of those networks, we've been able to centralise systems even more. And so once we centralise systems, we're able to actually to do more to the end client or the end user. And finally, to where we've looked at completely outsourcing parts of our solutions, of our technology solutions, to different vendors, and we can actually start outsourcing risk. So really the focus of management has changed over time from being very capital strategy around procurement and over long periods of time, sort of typically 7 years, and if you've ever worked in the utilities, it's actually 30 years, which is interesting in technology, to more agile processes which are a lower cost but a higher risk as they're put in, but because they're a lower cost, that risk is much more palatable. So originally, business risk was taken on and technology was built internally because you had no choice. There was only vendors and they just sold stuff and they said, right, you want this system, I'm going to sell it to you. And so strategy really was around about looking at that capital investment and about how we're going to actually put this big lump of money up front and how we're actually going to get the most out of this lump of money. We need to make sure that this is the right way forward for us as an organisation, and because we're actually investing quite heavily, we want to align as much of our processes back to this system so that we can get the most out of it over time. When we're looking at procurement tended to be quite long and complex. There was lots of components to a procurement process when you're putting in these bigger systems, these capital-intensive systems, and they tended to be over-bureaucratic as well, especially when you started working in government where you had large amounts of bureaucracy that were involved and issues around probity and all that sort of stuff. So it made procurement very, very difficult and very long. So once you actually got through the procurement process and did the implementation tended to be complex and it was very invasive and it was very difficult. So what happened was once you got to operation, it was like a steady state. Let's leave it and let's just keep working as long as we can, and let's actually, get the most out of the system before we have to make any changes. So so these big strategy investments, when we're looking at it, was really about how can I get more out of my stuff that I was putting in. And always this was quite advantageous and you knew what you were getting, you could control it and understand it, had the economy of scales and the surety of cost, but you had big upfront costs and you had lots of internal expertise that were needed and you held all the risk as an organisation. So as networks started improving and coming down in price, so I mean even 15 years ago when I was working in the ambulance service, we were lucky to get kilostream links between all of our various branches. But networks have become cheaper and cheaper and easier, and that's actually driven a lot of change into the technology world, and it's enabled more centralisation of systems, and we can actually start outsourcing various parts of our systems. So starting with data centre real estate and getting that out to specific people who can take that risk of that database. So I don't have to have a tier 4 database on my premise that data centre on my premise, someone else can actually look after that. And it's a system management and actually starting to outsource things as managed services. And again, it's really about moving the risk out of the organisation. So strategies were still very much about big investment, but it's like, okay, I'm going to make this investment, but how can I actually sort of start de-risking my investment here and pushing that back onto someone else? Again, procurement tended to be quite technology heavy, and what often happened in procurement was that replacement was just a newer version of what you already had. So an example is sometimes you'd get an old TDM PBX that was replaced with a TDM solution, with an IPT solution, but effectively it just did the same thing. You didn't get as many advantages out of that as you possibly could have. So now moving to a service-led approach where we're moving to being able to commoditise not just specific parts of our technology and our infrastructure, such as networks and our LAN and WAN infrastructure, but now moving to computing infrastructure, to storage infrastructure, and also into the applications themselves, where we can actually just buy what we need to use. And that's moving really into a utility type basis, where we can actually just buy exactly what we need at the time we need, and we can have a more flexible process where we just pay for how we need. This is really quite good because we get a much lower cost to entry. We haven't got these massive capital expenditures up front. The operational risks are more with the vendors than with the business, because they're looking after the software. They still own that software and those applications, so you don't have to bring that risk on site. And also, you're only really buying what you need, so you're only having to buy specifically, so you're not having to look at the big peaks and saying, right, well, I'm going to have to actually buy enough to get through the peaks at Christmas time when I haven't got much going on here, around the middle of the year. So what that's meant in the procurement type of things is that we've moved away from technology-led requirements and more moved towards business requirements for procurement. This has led to faster procurement, which has got more focused on the outcomes and the improved processes and efficiencies within the organisation, rather than being sort of towards particular technologies themselves. And this has led to more diverse applications that are running over your existing networks. And it's also led to differing architectures. So we're now seeing a lot of hybrid WANs emerging, which are part private WANs and MPLS solutions and part over the internet. So it's looking quite interesting. But the issues that we see, and I see this quite regularly, is that moving towards a more application-based, and sort of everything is being much smaller, and you can purchase stuff as a much more agile process. Strategy is sort of being put aside rather than being adapted to meet that particular that need and changing circumstances. So change control, when you move an application, you change your application, can be difficult and can be quite frustrating for users. And so I see a lot of proof of concepts being put in place. So one particular organisation I was working with, their local saying was that we've got more pilots than Qantas, because they're always piloting stuff continuously. Very frustrating for the end users. Also, when you're talking to the end users, it tends to actually only be specific groups that are being talked to. They're not looking at the whole organisation as a whole. So you try and put a new application, and run that over your existing networks, and parts of your organisation don't know about it. So, and a real classic is security don't know about it. And so your system runs like a complete dog, because you've got to transverse all these various security protocols to be able to make it work. And they haven't been brought along on the journey, and so the end users think, no, this is no good. And so what actually is a good application that will meet all your business needs doesn't get implemented effectively, and the pilot never really takes off. And finally, the last bit that we see is organisations don't have the service management rigour. So they've moved from owning a lot of stuff to trying to actually manage a whole lot of services, but they haven't got that rigour inside the organisation to be able to actually do that effectively, and they struggle along the way. Another big issue that I see quite regularly is commercials that haven't caught up with the technology. The sales guys come in and they sell you this wonderful dream about how you can actually buy just what you need, and this is fantastic. And you think, great, I can actually get this commodity-based application as my organisation grows and shrinks throughout the year to meet demand and to shrink with less demand. I'm only going to pay for what I need. But then when the commercial guys get together and they say, look, you've got to sign up for a minimum period of time, and you've got to buy a minimum amount of quantity to be able to actually for us to sell this to you. So it's not really a commodity-based or a consumption-based arrangement. A classic example of this is Telstra's TCCCP solution, which is the Telstra Cisco Cloud communications platform, which is sold as a cloud communications platform, but you have to sign up for minimum terms and minimum amounts of users to actually be able to access that system. Another issue that we see is organisations that do offer strategy are really just pushing their own solutions. There's quite a few organisations out there, and you know them, the likes of UXC, Data3, Data, Thomas Duryea, who have their own consulting arm, but really what they are is pre-sales. And so they're looking how they can fit and turn your solutions back into what they can actually provide. And so their solutions will always end up being them. So it doesn't necessarily work best for what's your requirements. Sometimes it does, but not always. And another strategy issue we see is that decisions are made at a tactical level rather than overall at a strategy level. So you tend to get all these little tactical jobs going on and they don't work together in a long-term strategy. And what does this mean? Well, the first thing is that user experience is suffering. So lots of applications implemented in virtual isolation and it reduces the application performance. So they're affecting each other because you're not actually working as an organisation to really look at this. Network architecture is another one where you're not bringing on board your network architects and your enterprise architects to actually work through what you're trying to do, and so you're working with legacy network architecture, so the applications don't necessarily work particularly well. Another example is when I've worked with a particular client that's really big on mobility and are actually trying to get a lot of their people out into the field and work out into the field, but their network architecture is really restricting them doing that, and so there's a whole raft of information when they're trying to log on that's transversing all their private WAN, which doesn't have to. They can actually re-architect their network and it'll work a lot better and they'll have a lot better user outcome. And the last part, and I've already mentioned it, is service management. This is poorly understood and poorly implemented in many organisations where they've tried to move to a service lead area and they don't quite understand how service management should go together. Ownership issues is the other issue that we see quite a lot, both externally, so you're buying applications and you've got a multi-vendor environment where you're using lots of vendors to buy different types of applications, but it becomes more difficult to deal with because you're not really sure where the issues are lying from, because your application vendor will say, no, my application's up and running the way that it should. Your network vendor is saying, look, there's lots of clear error in your pipes, there's nothing on problem here. Your database guys are saying, well, your databases are all spinning the way they should. So you get a lot of finger pointing and it's difficult to really figure out where the issues really are and where that ownership is. And the other problem we see is silos within business itself, exactly the same type of arrangements where you've got your network guys, your database guys, your server guys, your application guys. They've got their own tool sets, they've got the tool sets that actually work for what they particularly do, and they just look at their little silo. Their world is great, but they're not looking at their neighbour. And quite regularly, what we need to see to get a proper user experience is to actually look right across the whole gamut of what people are doing to be able to get a better solution. So how can we avoid these pitfalls? So the first one is to look at system and digital strategy. It really is to find the right business requirements and how to translate into something that's achievable and measurable. User experience really is key, and it's key when you want to use cloud in particular. And Reuben will be talking a little bit more about this in a few minutes. But we need to understand how applications affect the performance of the network, both now and into the future. So we need to understand how things are working at the moment and what the effect of any changes are going to be onto that network and what metrics we really need to look at to be able to understand, is my user experience really good, what we want to see. Also, do we need to re-architect our network? Looking at our network, is it a legacy network that was designed, several years ago for a particular purpose? You're changing your purpose. There may need to be a re-architecture need, and bringing to your procurement around your actual network providers and having that flexibility to be able to do that re-architecture. And then finally, are the metrics that you're looking at, are they actually relevant? Quite often when we look at SLAs, availability is the big one that's always brought out, but is availability really that relevant to what you're actually trying to do with your applications? And again, Hayden's going to talk a little bit about that too. So, and then finally, when we're looking at procurement, we really need to make sure that we can find the right solution and the right vendor that's going to meet our needs and what our requirements are. So we need to look at what the business needs are and to make sure that the user experience expectations rolls up into that. And so we actually get those, we get the experience, the users get the experience that they really want to do. For procurement, we're favouring a collaborative approach where we actually work with organisations like yourselves. We work with the vendors to actually find out what are your real business requirements and to cut down through all the RFT process to a point where we can find out what you're really trying to do and put technology aside, work out the business requirements and tailor the right solution back to that organisation. Saves a lot of time, effort and money. I've been very successful in doing this specifically around contact centres and around cloud procurement as well. So just to wrap up my little bit, what I've been talking about, strategy, it's still very important. So understanding the effects of multiple applications on your systems, what your vendors and delivery and approaches are going to do, you need to really be able to actually put this into a strategy to get the most out of it. We need to understand what the end user experience is meant to be and what good really looks like. What are we trying to achieve and what do we want our end users to really be able to get? And we also need to understand the business direction, what the outcomes are desired there. When we're procuring systems, it's understanding the business requirements much more than it is about the technology requirements and understanding what the business wants and the direction the business is wanting to take it. Technology isn't so important, it's really about the final outcomes that we're looking for. And the collaborative approach, we see much quicker procurements and implementations, which is much less disruptive to the organisation, to you as an organisation, at less cost for you and also for the suppliers. And it's important because they all hate it when they have to go through a massive big RFT that takes them weeks and weeks of work to do. So that's what I've been talking about. I'll hand over to Reuben in a minute, who'll be able to start talking about how end user experience and how that can be measured and looked after. So thank you very much.
iKara is an Aboriginal word. It stands for meeting place or weapon, depending on which way you are wanting to use it. So preferably meeting place. I think the tone here today is about how do you get people to collaborate, and we work with a number of lawyers. Hayden's one of those, and some of the most experienced lawyers in the world that we've spoken to in this space have told us that you end up being more of a counsellor than you are a lawyer. And in our case, we're very much about trying to facilitate the connection between working groups to understand how things work, because the world has been made up of silos. The last phase of IT has been about buying capacity. The next phase of IT is about making it actually do something consistent for less money. So iKara, weapon or meeting place, preferably meeting place. We're a performance management organisation. We specialise in application delivery. We've been working for the last 7 years, a group of us, 7 of us, for large NASDAQ listed entity, specialising in this conversation. We've worked in most of the major environments in Australia, so your ANZ banks, your BHP, your Rio Tinto, your Federal Police, you name it, we've probably seen that network. 94% of the Fortune 500 has the technologies that we're talking about, so we've been exposed to a lot of very complex environments during the last 7 years. And this presentation is designed to give you a little bit of an overview of what do we see consistently. So if we saw it once, we ignored it, but if we saw something consistently show its head up as a proof point for success, I think this is what I'm tabling with you guys today to consider. What did we learn? Understanding performance ties people and providers together. Plenty of times you've gone out and bought things and your bosses have signed them off, expecting that the outcome is implicit within the offer, the outcome being acceptable user experience. That's not always the case. And it's not until you understand performance that you're able to wed the multiple components that you run in your organisation to a single outcome. And when you know how to do that, you know how to measure TCO. People that don't know how to do that typically buy more stuff to see whether the phone's going to stop ringing or not. That's a very expensive way of doing IT. It suits the ambition of the vendor, of course, but it doesn't necessarily suit the ambition of the financial controller or anyone else. So it's important to understand what performance is, because if you don't, you're going to continue to pump money into that project until the users stop complaining. And you're generally not regarded in your organisation as being successful until people are happy. Performance really does dictate user satisfaction, and performance also dictates how you're probably going to be viewed in your organisation if you're involved in any of these projects. So as you walk past your boss in the foyer and you know it's working right, you can feel fairly confident. But if you're not sure, then maybe you should be less confident, and if you know it's not working, then I'll let you guys finish the statement. And the reason for that is that performance dictates organisational efficiency. So we might be in IT or procurement or parts of the organisational capability, but ultimately the CEO is looking at it from a point of view of which saying, how efficient are we as an organisation? And we've worked with people like Rio Tinto that understood that if we get 30,000 users logged into SAP differently, we can materially change the day that the ship sails. And that's going to impact the cost of our commodity by millions of dollars. That's going to make us inherently unproductive compared with BHP. So these things are in the mind of the CEO, and increasingly they're in the mind of the average user. If you look at Facebook, Facebook is built for user experience from the get-go. Users are not getting more, they're not allowing you to produce application slowness. They're actually getting more and more intent on getting an application outcome. They have less time for your slow application, which means that if you're slow, you stand out because all the other applications they're looking at in the social world have been built to deliver a user experience. Performance dictates ultimately how you're going to contract, and Hayden will cover that off. That's a really key part of this whole exercise. Risk sharing, the meeting place, the idea of getting people together to take things on without an implied outcome, but a categoric outcome. I think that's important because too often there's an implied outcome on performance, and it all falls back to capacity and availability, and Hayden will talk about what that means from an enforceability point of view in contract later. Ultimately, performance moves you from vendor best practice platinum boxes, by the kilo, by the tonne, however you want to buy them, to a proportionate architecture based on user experience. I'll talk a little bit more about real-world examples of where best practice is actually code word for you're going to help me make my target. In a way, owning applications is like owning a boat. It's quite exciting. I don't know what you guys feel like when you look at that, but you'd probably rather be there than here. The point is that, most customers don't understand that on the day you buy a boat, you've got some operational problems later on you've got to think about. In the same way, with applications, you've got the same issues. Almost every customer that we've dealt with over the last 7 years has been very excited about their application project. Right? So we understand the workflows, we understand that this application is going to make us more efficient. So let's get on with it. And everyone thinks that means it's going to work for the user. But unless it's explicit about why it's going to work for the user, that's just guesswork. Our job for the last 7 years has been to save customers from this phenomenon, which is, why isn't it working? We helped them understand the risks to the journey they were taking, provided tools and maps for the territory they're sailing in. So I'm using the boating analogy here because ultimately if you're in a boat, you've got some awareness of what you're trying to avoid and where you're trying to get to. You use maps, tools and other means to make sure that your journey is de-risked. All too often in IT, they don't have the tools, they don't really have maps. They've got individually crafted elements that fit in storage, in networks, in server teams, in applications, but no complete end-to-end journey or description of how they're going to get there. What do we do to help these organisations? We help them adequately understand the operational reality of performance so that they could make users happy and put their finger on what it was really going to cost to roll the application out. How do we do that? Again, go back to avoid best practice. Who do you turn to for application performance advice? Unless it's somebody who understands application performance, I'd suggest you don't turn to product vendors, network vendors, people with an axe to grind. You turn to people that understand application performance. It's just you turn to a lawyer for legal advice. Now, what happens here when you don't do that? Here's a real-world scenario. This is a theatre of war scenario. This is a military organisation rolling out Oracle, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of project. The application guy here is effectively saying, this works fine. So that's it. We're done. Let's go. Let's get it out there. So they roll it out. The problem is that this bloke out here off the satellite link is not having a good time. But when they do the maths, they can see that the guy connected to the terrestrially connected 2 meg link, he's fine. So they make the decision, after talking to their telco, that it must be about putting some network into the mix. And that particular proposition was a $10 million OPEX, because we're talking about every satellite site, theatre of war, for a 5 to 10 year contract, dialing up from 512 to 2 meg on every satellite connection, right? Now, around about the same time, someone from a vendor that specialises in storage and flash-based arrays happens to walk in and say, you know what you'd probably want to do? Make this storage environment, larger. I'm having a little bit of a problem here. Make this storage environment larger. And effectively, they pointed at that. Now, that was about a $2.5 million upgrade. And the problem with that is that on one side of the coin, you've got someone who's coming from the network side telling you spend $10 million, the other one's telling you to spend $2.5 million. The real issue was spend the money on the database and spend the money on how the application calls are happening for around about $3,000. It was a very, very simple fix. But how would you know that if you don't know how the application works? If all you do is invite people in with a pecuniary interest in the advice they're giving you, then it's little to no surprise that you're going to get told, this is best practice. However, it does not relate to the way the application performs in that environment. And the key point there is this is how project spend gets horribly out of control, by simply not understanding the user experience I'm trying to deliver to and the elements that contribute to that user experience. Going and talking to silos for their best guess at how to solve the problem. So where does our customer start to get this type of information? Define a picture of what good or acceptable user performance is. Move from siloed understanding of performance based on capacity and availability metrics. These are the standard T's and C's that suppliers give you. Hayden will address that shortly, why they're not enough. Select suppliers on their relevance to the performance you're chasing. Bring suppliers to the course you need to steer. So tell your supplier what performance you're looking for and what they're going to give you to help solve the problem. Don't just sit there and ask them, what do you think I should do here? Because you're effectively going to get sold. Define the impact of the third party's deliverables as it relates to your performance objectives, so you're able to share risk with them. And it's not a beat up. You're actually able to tell a telco why when they change latency on a network it has a material impact on your user experience and why you want to help them start servicing you more effectively. Importantly, there are no experts, only expert data. Every time we've found someone that professes to be an expert, typically they don't have any data to back the statement up. So I would suggest as you guys are looking around, start to build your own islands of information about where do we have really solid tools, really solid data. This is not me saying you don't have these things already. This is me saying they're probably carefully hidden away. And the idea is to get them out and start talking about that meeting place concept and get people together and start collaborating on that. Teams that have a common dialect of performance typically are more effective. We've worked in banks where in parallel the network team was designing a VPN strategy whilst the data centre team and application team were designing a terminal services Citrix strategy. These two technologies are totally not going to work together. But this is inside the same organisation at the same time space. If they'd had a conversation on performance, there is no way possible they could have contemplated that. And they spent probably 6 to 12 months of digging in opposite directions to work out, oh, hang on a tick, we've actually got a problem here. So a couple of real-world tales. Large global fashion industry. What were they trying to do? They're trying to deploy an ERP system, but they're also needing to cut OPEX. I would argue that people my age made them famous by wearing their T-shirts, and I'm still wearing their T-shirts and now I'm sending them bust because my kids won't buy them. So bottom line is they needed to save a few bucks. The question here is, what is the least risk position? So the best practice architecture is what they had. Remember I spoke about best practice. So who did they ask? They asked the application vendor, what do I buy here? And what they got was this. Now this is expensive. And it doesn't define user experience, so it doesn't mitigate the risk. So it's not meeting any of the project objectives, but it will make the application get out there. We don't know what it'll do, but it'll be expensive and should work. What's our involvement? To define acceptable user experience and refine the architecture to the least cost, best performance basis. Scope. We were able to sit down with a user in a place called Hopgood, which is a little village up in France, where the server was sitting right next to the person designing the shirt. And our objective was to work out, could we make the application work from anywhere on planet Earth to that same experience, give or take? What we managed to do is that we could do that. Right? So we got down to within 5% of that performance from a single redundant data centre. We used a VPN instead of an MPLS network, which is a very cheap internet connection. And we used the native the native web client, which is a far more cost-effective option rather than deploying another layer of terminal services. Bottom line was about 85% savings, and within 5%. So think about it, 3 data centres, lots and lots of technology, Move to much lower cost, same performance. Why go the other path? How do we know how to do it? Understand how the application works. But as a customer, you've got to have governance. You've got to have the ability to bring your team together, and you've got to have the culture that resists experts and looks for the expert data rather than that the messiah of performance. Large mining organisation, they need to deploy SAP and document them. They had 6 global instances. It was the largest single mining instance. This is currently the largest single mining instance of SAP anywhere in the world. At the time, it was the largest mining instance of SAP in 6 locations. Our job was to work out how do we get it into one, redundant, and make the performance stay consistent. Because remember that if the ship sails late, then the cost of the commodity changes. And that's not going to happen anytime soon while this particular CEO is on watch. So we had to find a way of crafting this performance to a least cost platform with the same consistent performance. So we're able to do that. Again, it came down to the customer ultimately, right? It doesn't come down to people like us. It comes down to people like you sitting in your environment and steering your organisation to the objective of user experience and least cost. So questions you can ask your team. How do we know we're doing this? Because most people will either tell you we're not doing it at all, or yes, we are doing it. The question for you guys to ask your teams is these ones. What does good look like for my users? So can somebody show me scientifically what good performance is here for the end user, please? Show me the interdependent baseline for service delivery. That is, show me how this server, storage, network, application person, third party collectively collaborate in performance and at an operations level. Show me how we're risk sharing with third parties. If you don't do this, you will wear all the risk. We're starting to see customers get finely tuned to this idea that if I know how it works and I can get that ensconced in a contract with a guy like Hayden, I've just moved a whole bunch of risk out of my business. I've just brought down the cost. I've almost fixed my cost. I've fixed my risk. This is a fantastic place to be. So we see this as the new horizon, if you like, for how you can use some of this business intelligence to then invite people like Hayden into the room to put a much more risk-mitigated program of work together with your third parties, and also to tie your teams together internally to a common objective. With that, I'll introduce Hayden to the stage. Thank you.
For my part of today's session, what I want to focus on is just, I guess, drawing on some of the things that Ian and Reuben have spoken about there and looking at them through, I guess, a concrete sense of how some of these principles might be embodied within the primary legal document that we have available to define what good is, which is some of the points that Reuben and Ian were mentioning about before. What does good look like for your organisation? What is the type of performance that's actually relevant for your organisation, not necessarily being boxed into some generic service level agreement that's being presented to you by a service provider, but understanding what your requirements are, going through that process, talking to people like Ian and Reuben to make sure that you actually understand that, and then making sure that it is documented in the legal agreement which defines that, which is the service level agreement. So just a little bit of background to introduce service level agreements as a concept. To present an ideal world view, service level agreements, and I emphasise this is the ideal world view. There's a double rainbow there for a reason. It rarely happens this way. In an ideal world, service level agreements should operate so as to require little human involvement, and that there should be little legal expenditure. You shouldn't necessarily be having to go to lawyers all the time to actively enforce a service level agreement. It should be embedded within the fabric of your organisation, and enforcing it should be quite simple. It should, and really as a concept is the whole point of it, is to drive continuous improvement on the service provider's end. To incentivise the service provider through a series of sticks, effectively, which I'll talk about, to make them perform in accordance with what you require. Here's a big stick. Well, the root causes of issues in an ideal world should be readily ascertainable, but we all know that's not the case a lot of the time, and ultimately our users should be happy. In the real world, what happens is more something like this with service level agreements. There is so much blame shifting that goes on, it will take your breath away. The moment you go to try and enforce a service level, you can guarantee a lot of the time that the first thing the service provider or vendor is going to do is trying to find a reason to say it's not my fault, it's someone else's fault. And when we talk about shared services environments like cloud environments that are so easy to do, I can point the finger at the telecommunications provider, I can point the finger at you, at the customer for doing something, I can point the finger at the software vendor who might have released an update and broke the interoperability of the whole system. There's a whole lot of things I could look to here. And I'll talk to that. But just to introduce some of the basic concepts, the service level agreement as a concept, in my experience, it tends to be something that can be forgotten as part of a broader procurement strategy. All the time and effort goes in to looking at the primary commercial agreement, to which often the service level agreement is a schedule or an annexure. A lot of effort goes into putting in the requirements document, which is extremely important. I'm not trying to derogate from the importance of that. But then the service level agreement is something which is just a schedule to these other documents. And often there's no real key stakeholder who says, that is my document that I'm responsible for. Because the service level agreement often, contains, it's not your typical legal document. It contains a whole lot of technical terms of things like availability, capacity, clause response times, latency, loss, jitter. A lot of lawyers will look at that and just think, well, I presume the technical team have looked at this and it looks pretty good to me. Look at those high percentages, that looks great. And equally, probably some of the technical team and the procurement team involved might focus on points like that, but lose picture as to whether the service levels are actually enforceable in a legal sense, or to how they might practically be enforced, or to how blame shifting might be avoided, and how to prevent broad exclusions to the relevant service levels. So, service levels as a concept, they're designed to measure what good is, what your requirements are. In order to ensure that they are actually enforceable, we need to try and ensure that service levels themselves are objective and measurable. That's the baseline upon which we measure things relative to our user experience. Now, certain measures might be inherently objective, something that's based on some sort of mathematical formula, something that we can readily point the finger to and say, I know that's 99.999%. Other things might not be inherently objective, they might be softer. Things like how our users feel about using the application, that sort of thing. That's not to say that you can't use those in a service level agreement, but if they aren't inherently objective, then we have to contractually agree in the document on the agreed measures, and those agreed measures themselves need to be inherently objective. Now, service credits, as I said, are the stick that we can wield against a service provider to try and make them perform in accordance with what we need them to do. They're designed to compensate a customer where a service provider hasn't performed in accordance with the agreed service levels. Now, I guess an important point of law here is we need to distinguish a service credit from other things like a breach of warranty or an indemnity right. Typically, what a service credit is an agreed amount of money which the service provider and the customer say, this is what my loss will be if you don't perform in accordance with this particular level. So I guess it's an agreed estimate of likely losses that could be incurred. So in that sense, it's actually more akin, and indeed really is, in substance, a form of liquidated damages. So when we talk about liquidated damages at law, there can be some issues with them in an enforceability perspective. We need to ensure that the liquidated damages aren't likely to be struck down as an unenforceable contractual penalty. Contractual damages as a whole are intended to be compensatory rather than punitive. So if something goes wrong at the service provider's end, you're meant to be made whole, and the amount of loss that you estimate you've suffered should be given to you, but you shouldn't be put in a better position. You're not intended to profit from the service provider's poor performance. So we need to be a little bit careful when we draft service level agreements to ensure we don't fall afoul of this doctrine. Otherwise, it's going to be tricky to actually enforce. If we just draft a straight linear service credit arrangement where the service provider doesn't meet the relevant service level and all of a sudden the reduction is that the next month or next quarter's fees are dropped down to zero, it's likely to be deemed a contractual penalty and unenforceable. I think it's important that we understand the life cycle for service levels, just because in my experience we spend a heap of time here. And that's in the good instance. A lot of the time people won't even look too much at that first point, which is the negotiation of the SLA. So when we're doing things probably better than average, we're spending a fair bit of time focusing on actually negotiating the service level. And once that's done, the contract's agreed, we put it away and we don't look at it until things go terrible. And things have gone so bad that it's the relationship between the customer and the service provider is almost beyond repair, and you're looking to try and get out of the contract, for instance. That's often when we look at it again. That is not the best way to operate. That's the way you operate if you want to lead yourselves into a position where you're looking at expensive litigation, which is what we want to avoid ultimately. So we want to understand the full life cycle of a service level agreement. It doesn't stop at negotiation. We need to start building these other steps into the fabric of our organisation and make service level monitoring and service level enforcement something that all of the people within your relevant team understand and play an active role in. And it shouldn't necessarily require you to jump and go to lawyers straight away. SLA monitoring is something that can be done by your people. It can be something that's done by a third party, and I'll talk to why I think actually SLA monitoring by third parties is inherently a good idea. It should be something that can, in theory, if you draft the service level agreement properly and objectively and clearly and minimise blame shifting, it should be able to be done almost autonomously, potentially via a software application. We detect a violation. A notice of a violation is given to the customer saying this service level has been breached, and then you just automatically send a letter out to the service provider saying this. It shouldn't be a complex process, and this should be ongoing throughout the life of the contract. So again, just trying to understand what's, from my experience, some of the issues are with service levels and how we can try and learn from that and make sure it doesn't happen in your own organisations. Service levels a lot of the time will be generic or unclear, particularly with cloud service agreements. Because, I suppose, drawing on some of the things that Ian spoke about before, the approach with, I guess, procuring cloud services, sometimes there's an easy inclination to think I'm not going to spend $10 million up front. I don't have this big capital expenditure risk hanging over me. So what does it matter if I don't really look to really understand and properly deal with the risks in this particular project? What if I know I'm just going to pay on a subscription basis, but that, I would argue, only considers part of the picture and part of the risk. Obviously, if you're stuck on a long-term agreement, you can't get out of it necessarily easily, and if the contract doesn't embody what you actually require, well, it's going to be hard for me to legally say you've got grounds to terminate that particular contract. On top of that, it creates a whole lot of business continuity risk, because if your users are unhappy or can't do things that they need to do as part of their business, well, that's going to cause a lot of problems for you as well. You don't want to have to suffer in silence for years. So in terms of things that are generic or unclear, we often see things like, I'll talk to availability as a particular issue. Blame shifting as well, I've spoken about that. The first thing they'll try and do is look to point fingers at someone else. I think what we want to do when drafting good service level agreements to avoid blame shifting is understand as a customer what are the things in my control that I can do and I can stop from happening. Draw a line under that. And then everything else that falls above that line or outside of that line, they're the particular things that you need to allocate responsibility for in the service level agreement. They're the things that are outside your control, and some of them might be within the service provider's direct control. Maybe they're outside of both your control, but you still need to contractually allocate responsibility for those things that are outside each party's control. Otherwise, when something does come up, I can guarantee you that what will happen is they will point to those things that are outside both parties' control and say, that's why I don't have to pay a service credit. Insufficient data. When we look to try and understand whether a service level has been breached, we'll look to the data that's given to us. But again, a really common problem is we look to the data that's often given to us by the service provider, and the service provider is the last person whose data you should trust. They're the ones who are going to suffer the most if, as it turns out, the data they're giving you shows that they've got to have to pay you a whopping big service credit for a particular period, which they don't want to do. So relying on their data is to be absolutely avoided in my view, and equally relying on the customer's data. Look, it's good for you if you're the customer if you can do that, provided you've got adequate sort of systems in place within your organisation. I wouldn't necessarily say that's a bad idea, but maybe it might be better just to think about getting an independent third party and appointing that independent third party or an independent application provider or software application to be responsible for actually monitoring performance of the service level. That way it's going to be much easier, and we should contractually specify that in the document. This particular application or this particular party is responsible for monitoring performance of the service level, and they will provide reports in accordance with X. And if their reports show something like non-compliance with the service level, then a service credit is issued. Makes it much easier. So I've already spoken about cloud services, I guess, and why I think, in my view, it's a particular risk when we talk about service levels in terms of making sure that we're not being forced into something that is presented to you as a commodity. I suppose we've all started to move towards cloud environments. Yes, there's all these benefits associated with it potentially, but because it's a shared service environment, often what's presented to you is some generic vanilla document in terms of a service level agreement that has no regards for your organisation. The performance requirements of particular applications within your organisation might be completely different to another organisation. You might run a specific application which has very high performance requirements, and that particular application might be critical for your business. And to take that, put it in a cloud environment and be subject to some sort of generic SLA that has no regard to that is going to be asking for problems, in my view. So the perception of cloud services as a commodity, I think, in large part is a generalisation and is wrong. When we talk about IT, we're talking about process a lot of the time, and some processes maybe are a commodity. But a lot of the time, the processes of customer A are completely different to the processes of customer B. And ramming it and trying to fit it into some sort of fixed model that the cloud service provider says you have to fit in is asking for problems. Availability, I think, is a good point just to speak to, because this is the most common service level you'll see in a cloud agreement. It's the one you'll see all the time, and maybe this looks really great. This looks like a pretty good availability service level. We've broken it down by categories in order to avoid the penalties doctrine. We've had regard to the various types of loss, and we've put in a genuine pre-estimate of our loss for each category of non-compliance with the relevant service level. It's all good. But the problem is, an application might be available and meet this particular requirement or perform outside of it. Be really, really good. It is available 99.999999% of the time. But does that actually mean your users are happy? Because if the application itself is performing poorly, it's slow, it's unresponsive, users can't actually use it in the way they want to, and they're complaining to you constantly, does this mean that you actually have done a good thing in negotiating this service level? If that's all you have, has the procurement project been successful? And I would say it completely hasn't. It's missed the point altogether, because availability is just a tiny piece of the puzzle. There's a much broader picture to think about. So just in summing up on my last two slides, I just wanted to take us through a quick summary of what I think should be in a good service level agreement. We should understand the internal and external factors that influence service performance, and we should expressly allocate responsibility for those factors in the document. Don't leave it undocumented. Don't leave it unsaid, because that will cause trouble later. We need to align the service levels with the specific needs of the business. Your business is different to everyone else's, and the requirements that need to be present in terms of service levels may indeed be different. So don't simply accept generic service levels. Sometimes it's appropriate. Maybe there's a cost-benefit analysis factor that goes into it, but you need to go through that process and understand it at least. You need to understand a baseline of your expectations for performance, and you need to measure that baseline. You need to talk to people like Reuben and to people like Ian to understand that, and it needs to be documented in the contract. And you need to carefully consider who's responsible for capturing service level data. So as I said, the key part of the service level life cycle is monitoring and automatically detecting non-compliance. You want to avoid having to go to lawyers all the time to enforce it. So we need to understand who's responsible for providing the data, make it objective, make it clear, and specify it in the contract. Also, consider whether it's relevant to contract for our actual solution. If what you're getting is not just an individual moving part, but a sum of moving parts, if any one of those moving parts breaks or something's changed within it, consider how that might affect the overall solution. So a good example of that might be is you're outsourcing a particular part of your business requirements into a cloud environment. consists of multiple applications, and those applications have all sorts of custom interfaces between them, and someone updates one interface, one of the software applications that breaks the interoperability between the solution, that's going to cause problems. It's a common cause of issue. So if that's not dealt with in the document in a clear way as to who's responsible for that, again, there's going to be uncertainty and ambiguity when you go to try and enforce the service levels. Consider how subjective service levels can be objectively measured and specify that within the contract. And as I said, the tools to measure and report on service level performance should be specified. Avoid sort of a battle of the reports or a battle of the data where the service provider says, well, my data says it's okay, your data says it's bad, whose is to be believed. Consider whether the service credits you're seeking to enforce are an actual genuine pre-estimate of the loss you're going to incur. You don't want them to be an unenforceable penalty. And within your organisation, try and train your people as part of procurement, once the project's actually agreed, how they all play a role in ensuring an ongoing commitment to the service level agreement lifecycle. Monitor, detect and enforce ongoing throughout the project. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.